My name is Victor Hayes. I am 69 years old, and until just a few weeks ago, I truly believed I had earned a quiet, peaceful retirement. Then one afternoon, my son-in-law walked straight into my home, dropped his heavy bags onto my custom oak table, and calmly told me to clear out. According to him, his family needed the best rooms in the house, and it was my responsibility to make space for them. I slowly rose to my feet, gave him a calm smile, and told him he could start by packing those bags and leaving. I assumed that would put an end to his arrogance. I had no idea he was carrying a single piece of paper that would turn my peaceful sanctuary into a battlefield. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and if you have ever had to teach an arrogant relative a lesson they will never forget, go ahead and like and subscribe. Let me explain exactly how this nightmare began. The heavy oak door of my mountain cabin didn't simply open that afternoon. It was kicked in with force. The loud crash echoed through the quiet living room, shattering the calm I had finally earned after decades of hard work. I looked up from my leather armchair as Derek, my 34-year-old son-in-law, stormed inside with my daughter Alyssa following silently behind him. Derek wore one of his expensive tailored suits, something that looked completely out of place in a rustic mountain cabin. He didn't even bother removing his muddy shoes, leaving dirty tracks across the hand-woven rug my late wife had once picked out with such care. He walked straight to the center of the room and dropped a heavy leather duffel bag onto the spotless glass coffee table. The glass creaked under the sudden weight. I looked at the bag, then back up at him, waiting for some explanation for that level of disrespect. Derek didn't even bother with a greeting. He folded his arms, puffed out his chest, and spoke to me in a tone normally used for servants who had stepped out of line. "Listen carefully, old man," he said, his voice bouncing off the wooden walls. "My parents and the entire Bennett family are coming up here this weekend, all 20 of them. We're hosting a big family reunion, so you need to move out of the master suite today and take your stuff down to the storage shed behind the cabin." I stayed silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then I looked past him toward my daughter. Alyssa, the girl I had raised, protected, and supported her entire life, couldn't even look me in the eye. She stared at the floor instead, shifting nervously and twisting the expensive wedding ring on her finger. At that moment, it became painfully clear she was part of this. After a moment, she glanced up and said quietly, "Dad, just do what he says, please. It's only for a few days. We really need everything to be perfect." The weakness in her voice disgusted me. Derek took my silence as surrender and continued speaking with even more arrogance. "This place is way too big for you anyway," he scoffed while glancing around the room with obvious contempt. "You just sit around here all day doing nothing. We're going to put this property to better use. Honestly, it's basically our early inheritance, so we're taking control starting today. My parents get your room. They actually appreciate luxury. The rest of the family will take the guest rooms. You can stay in the shed and help with catering when they arrive tomorrow morning. Try to make yourself useful for once, instead of just taking up space." The nerve of that statement hung in the air like poison. This arrogant man truly believed he could walk into my home and order me around like hired help. Slowly I uncrossed my legs and stood up from my chair. I'm still a tall man, and despite my age, my build still reflects the decades I spent working as an engineer. I stepped around the coffee table until I stood just inches away from him, forcing him to tilt his head slightly upward. Then I gave him a calm, cold smile. "You have exactly 5 seconds, I said quietly, my voice steady, to take that bag off my table. After that, you're going to pack everything and leave my property." Derek had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. When he looked at me, he saw nothing more than a retired old man who liked fishing on weekends. He assumed I was soft. He assumed this cabin was simply some lucky piece of property waiting to be claimed. What he didn't know was that I spent 40 years working as a chief structural engineer for one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the country. I never had a trust fund. I didn't inherit a single dollar. I climbed scaffolding in freezing rain, supervised ruthless contractors, and dealt with corporate sharks who believed they owned the world. 20 years ago, I bought this land when it was nothing but dirt and pine trees. I poured decades of work into building this cabin with my own hands. I laid the foundation. I designed the structure. Every wooden beam and every stone in that fireplace was paid for with my own labor. This place was my sanctuary. I built it for my late wife, Margaret. It was meant to be our peaceful retreat, far away from the noise and greed of the city. Since she passed away, it's been the only place where I truly feel close to her. Every corner of this house holds memories of the life we built together, and now, this entitled finance director who married my daughter believed he could simply walk in and turn my sanctuary into his family's weekend resort. He actually believed his job title and privilege gave him the right to erase my life's work. He had made a serious miscalculation. I wasn't some fragile old man waiting to fade away. I was someone who understood foundations, and I also knew exactly how to bring one crashing down. Instead of backing off, Derek suddenly laughed out loud. It was a mocking, arrogant laugh. He looked at me like I had just told the most ridiculous joke. "You really think you're still in charge here?" he asked with a smug grin. Then he reached inside his designer jacket and pulled out a neatly folded document. He slapped it down on the glass table next to his dirty bag. "Go ahead," he said. "Read it and cry." I slowly picked up the paper. It was a power of attorney document. According to it, Alyssa and Derek had been granted full legal authority over the management of this property and all associated assets. My eyes scanned the text until they reached the bottom. My signature was right there, and it was real. My mind started racing as I tried to figure out how something like this could have happened. Then the memory hit me like a freight train. A month earlier, I had been in the hospital for minor gallbladder surgery. I had been heavily medicated and barely fully aware of what was happening around me. Alyssa had visited that day, carrying a thick stack of discharge papers and insurance forms. She told me I needed to sign them quickly, so I could be released and go home. I trusted my daughter completely. I signed the pages without carefully reading every document. She had slipped this legal form into that stack. Derek leaned closer to me, his eyes shining with cruel satisfaction. "It's too late, old man," he whispered. "Alyssa already transferred the property management rights to me. You're basically just a guest in this house now. So grab your stuff and head to the shed before I call the police and have you escorted off the mountain." That was the moment the real game began. I slowly lowered the document and turned my attention away from Derek. My eyes settled on Alyssa, the little girl I once carried on my shoulders, the daughter I worked double shifts to send to an expensive private college, was standing right in front of me, and she still refused to look me in the eye. She stared down at the wooden floor as if the grain in the boards was suddenly fascinating. The silence in that room was suffocating. I waited for her to step forward, to say it was all a misunderstanding, to grab the paper from Derek and apologize for the insult. But she did nothing. She simply stood there beside the man who was actively trying to steal my home. My heart didn't break in that moment. It turned to ice. The betrayal washed over me, replacing every bit of fatherly warmth with something cold and calculating. She wasn't my little girl anymore. She was an adult who had willingly taken part in a plan against her own father. I took a slow breath and spoke calmly. "Look at me, Alyssa," I said. "Look me in the eye and tell me you agree with this." She finally lifted her head. The expression on her face was a miserable mix of guilt and irritation, as if I was the one making things unnecessarily difficult. "Dad, please don't make a big scene," she said, stepping out slightly from behind Derek. "We're just trying to help you. You're getting older, and managing a property this large is too much for one person. We're doing this for your own good." I stared at her in disbelief. "For my own good?" I repeated slowly. "I'm 69, Alyssa, not 90. I run 10 miles a week. I manage my own investments. I built this house myself. What exactly do you think I need help with?" Derek stepped forward, sliding a possessive arm around her shoulders. "You forget things, old man," he interrupted. "Last year you missed a property tax deadline. Alyssa is just being a responsible daughter and making sure your assets are protected. Everything we've done is completely legal. We're in charge now." I remembered that tax deadline perfectly. I had missed it by 2 days because I was in another state arranging my younger brother's funeral. They were twisting my grief into a story about incompetence. Alyssa nodded quickly, backing up his ridiculous claim. "Exactly, Dad. Derek understands real estate. He's a finance director. He knows how to maximize a property like this. He's going to make sure this place is fully optimized," Alyssa continued confidently. "When we're not using it, we can rent it out. It's just smart business. Honestly, you should be thanking us for taking such a huge burden off your shoulders so you can finally relax." A wave of pure disgust rose inside me. She sounded exactly like Derek, repeating his words as if she had been programmed to do so. My daughter had traded her integrity and loyalty for the illusion of status that Derek and his arrogant family dangled in front of her. Before I could tear apart her ridiculous argument, a loud chorus of car horns suddenly blared from the driveway. The sharp noise shattered the tense silence inside the cabin. Derek's family had arrived. I turned toward the large front window and saw 3 sleek black luxury SUVs pulling into my driveway. Their heavy tires crushed the clean gravel I had leveled only a week earlier. Doors swung open, and a swarm of loud, entitled people poured out, laughing and shouting like they had just arrived at a luxury resort for a wild weekend vacation. Derek clapped his hands together with excitement and flashed a wide grin. "Perfect," he announced proudly. "The whole family is finally here." Then he looked back at me with a smug expression. "Remember what I told you, old man. Head down to the shed and stay out of our way. We've got a lot of unpacking to do, and we don't need you crowding the place." I stood quietly, watching the chaos unfolding outside my window, while the truth of their deception settled heavily in my mind. Piece by piece, I reconstructed the past month the way an engineer studies a damaged structure. This wasn't some spontaneous act of greed. It had been a carefully planned trap designed to strike when I was at my weakest. 4 weeks earlier, I had been admitted to the hospital for a routine gallbladder surgery. The operation itself went smoothly, but the anesthesia and pain medication left me groggy and disoriented for several days. During that time, Alyssa visited me every afternoon. I believe she was simply being a caring daughter. She brought soup, held my hand, and talked about how worried she had been about my health. On the day I was scheduled to be discharged, she came into my hospital room carrying a thick clipboard filled with paperwork. She said they were standard discharge forms and complicated insurance documents that needed my signature before I could leave. She pointed to each line and told me exactly where to sign so we could hurry home and I could recover in my own bed. Because she was my daughter, I trusted her completely. I signed every page she handed me without even putting on my reading glasses or checking the fine print. Hidden among those papers was the power of attorney document. My own daughter had used my illness, my medication, and my trust to steal the roof over my head. My late wife, Margaret, had warned me about this for years. She used to say Alyssa's desperate need to impress wealthy people and belong to high society would eventually corrupt her judgment. I never wanted to believe it. I always chose to see the good in my child. But standing there now, staring at that stolen signature, I realized Margaret had been right all along. The kind daughter we raised was gone, replaced by someone driven by shallow ambition and greed. She had traded her father for the approval of people who didn't even respect her. The front door swung open again, and Charles Bennett, Derek's father, stepped inside. Charles carried himself with the smug arrogance of a man who had inherited wealth without ever earning it. He wore a crisp polo shirt and expensive loafers while looking around my custom-built cabin with a critical, judgmental expression. He didn't greet me. He didn't even acknowledge me. His eyes moved across the room as if he were inspecting a piece of property rather than someone's home. "Well, it has a certain rustic charm," he muttered loudly. "It'll need a full remodel, but the land has potential." His wife Eleanor followed behind him, complaining about the mountain air ruining her hair. Charles walked straight toward me and stopped only a few feet away. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy set of car keys, and tossed them directly at my chest. I caught them out of instinct before they hit the floor. "Hey, buddy," he said with a condescending grin, speaking the way someone talks to a valet at a fancy restaurant. "The black SUV is blocking the driveway. Move it around to the side, and then start bringing our luggage up to the master bedroom. And be careful with those leather bags. They cost more than you make in a year." Derek stood nearby, grinning like this entire humiliation was the best entertainment he'd ever seen. Alyssa turned her face away again, too cowardly to say a single word in my defense. They expected me to explode, to throw the keys back and create a scene. They could record and later use as proof that I was unstable. But I didn't give them that satisfaction. I didn't shout. I didn't lose control. I simply closed my hand around the keys, looked at Charles with a completely blank expression, and walked toward the door. The cold mountain air hit my face as I stepped outside and headed toward his luxury SUV, but I had no intention of parking his vehicle or carrying his luggage. The moment I was out of their sight, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and switched on the small voice recorder I always carried. It was a habit from my years dealing with dishonest contractors on construction sites. I recorded hostile conversations whenever things felt suspicious. This situation had already crossed that line. Their little game had begun, but they had no idea I was quietly gathering evidence. I walked up to the SUV and calmly placed Charles's keys right on the hood of the spotless vehicle. I didn't park the car, and I certainly didn't touch a single piece of luggage. Instead, I moved along the wraparound porch and headed toward the side entrance of my cabin to grab a few essential items from the mudroom. The temperature was dropping quickly as the sun disappeared behind the tall pine trees, stretching long shadows across the property. With stiff fingers, I reached for the keypad on the smart lock and entered my usual 6-digit code. The keypad flashed bright red and emitted a sharp error beep. I paused, assuming the cold wind had made my fingers slip. I tried again, carefully entering the numbers one by one. Another red flash. Another loud beep. Access denied. The deadbolt stayed locked, sealing the door to the home I had built with my own hands. I slowly looked up at the small security camera mounted above the door, a cold feeling settling deep in my chest. A moment later, my phone buzzed inside my pocket. It was a text message from Derek. It read, "I updated the security codes for our safety. The shed out back is unlocked. Have a good night, old man." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the message again and again. He had deliberately locked me out of my own house in the freezing mountain air, forcing a 69-year-old man to sleep in an unheated storage shed. It was cruelty, calculated and deliberate. I stood on the porch for a long moment while the cold wind cut through my jacket. Through the large living room windows, I could see warm golden light spilling across the deck, and inside the house I could see shadows moving around. The Bennett family had already settled in like they owned the place, spreading through my cabin like a swarm of well-dressed locusts. I turned away from the warm glow of the house and walked down the dirt path toward the large storage shed I had built years earlier to store my tools and landscaping equipment. I pushed open the creaky wooden door and stepped into the dark, dusty space. The air smelled stale, thick with motor oil, dried paint, and sawdust. It was freezing inside. The uninsulated wooden walls offered absolutely no protection from the cold mountain air. I flipped the light switch, and a single exposed bulb flickered on, bathing the shed in a harsh, yellow glow. Derek hadn't bothered preparing anything for me. There was no bed, no heater, not even a blanket. I was expected to sleep on the hard concrete floor like some stray animal. I walked over to a stack of plastic storage bins and pulled out a few old moving blankets I used when transporting lumber. I spread them over flattened cardboard boxes in the corner, creating a crude makeshift mattress. Sitting down on the cold cardboard, I pulled my jacket tighter and rubbed my hands together for what little warmth I could manage. From the hill above, I could hear loud bass-heavy music and bursts of laughter echoing from my cabin. They had already fired up my expensive outdoor grill, and the smell of premium steaks drifted down the slope. I could hear Charles Bennett's booming voice bragging about some country club golf tournament, while Eleanor shrieked with laughter about the terrible cell phone reception on the mountain. They were celebrating their takeover without the slightest hint of guilt. They were drinking my vintage wine, eating my food, and sleeping in the custom oak bed I had built for my late wife, Margaret. The arrogance of it all could have driven a weaker man to storm up the hill, break a window, and demand his home back. But I stayed seated on my cardboard mattress, breathing slowly in the icy air and steadying my heart. I have never been the type of man who reacts with blind anger. My entire career was built on analyzing structures, calculating stress points, load limits, and vulnerabilities. Derek believed he had stripped me of every ounce of power by locking me inside a wooden box behind my own house. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, playing a high-stakes game of real estate chess against a helpless old fool. What he didn't realize was that he had just locked himself inside a technological trap I had designed myself. When I told them I had worked as a structural engineer, I simplified the story for their limited understanding. During my 40 years in commercial development, I didn't just design concrete foundations and steel frames. I supervised the installation of advanced security networks for corporate skyscrapers and government buildings. I specialized in building hidden surveillance systems capable of protecting billions of dollars in corporate assets. When I constructed this cabin 20 years ago, I didn't hire a local contractor to install a cheap alarm system. I personally wired the entire property from the inside out. I installed miniature cameras inside air vents, concealed them behind custom woodwork, and embedded others within the stone masonry of the fireplace. I created a closed-loop surveillance network connected to a private server hidden right here inside this shed. I built the system originally to keep Margaret safe when my work forced me to travel for long stretches. It allowed me to watch over her, even when I couldn't physically be there. Derek believed he was a genius for changing the password on the smart lock using his phone. What he didn't know was that every room in that cabin was transmitting crystal-clear audio and high-definition video straight to my private server. He thought he had thrown me out and blinded me to everything happening inside. In reality, he had placed himself directly inside my observation deck. From here, I could watch every move he made, hear every word he spoke, and record every mistake he committed. I stood from my makeshift bed and walked to the back wall of the shed. Behind a stack of old paint cans, I removed a false wooden panel that blended perfectly with the surrounding boards. Hidden behind it was a heavy metal lockbox built directly into the wall frame. I entered a 12-digit code and pulled the door open. Inside sat a powerful laptop connected to a compact server bank humming quietly in the cold air. I powered up the system and logged into my master control interface, bypassing several layers of encrypted security. Within seconds, the large monitor filled with live camera feeds from inside the cabin. I could see everything. One camera showed Eleanor digging through Margaret's old jewelry boxes in the master bedroom, casually tossing aside pieces she considered cheap. Another showed Charles in the kitchen pouring himself a massive glass of my rarest scotch and drinking it like it was ordinary whiskey. But the feed that truly caught my attention was from the main living room. Derek was pacing back and forth in front of the stone fireplace, with his phone pressed tightly to his ear. He looked nothing like the confident bully who had kicked my door open earlier that day. Now he looked nervous, almost frantic. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and he kept biting his thumbnail while talking. I isolated the microphone feed from the fireplace and turned the volume up. Derek spoke in a low, anxious voice. "Yes, I understand the deadline," he said, rubbing his forehead. "The collateral is secured. I'm standing inside the property right now. It's a custom luxury cabin, worth at least $3 million, maybe more. I have a fully executed power of attorney signed by the owner. We can move forward with the $2 million commercial loan immediately. I need those funds wired to my investment group by Monday morning, or we're completely finished. Federal audits and everything. Monday morning, do you understand?" I leaned closer to the screen as the full scale of his crime became clear. Derek hadn't moved his family into my home for a simple vacation. His investment firm was collapsing, and he planned to use my cabin as collateral for a fraudulent $2 million loan. He was stealing the property I spent decades building just to cover his own catastrophic failures. I leaned back slowly in my chair, a cold smile forming on my face. This situation was no longer about a stolen cabin. Now it involved federal wire fraud. The next morning, the mountain air was razor sharp, slicing through the thin gaps in the shed walls. I had barely slept. I sat wrapped in my jacket, watching the glowing monitors when the shed door rattled loudly. I quickly powered down the screens, leaving only a harmless black screensaver running before Alyssa stepped inside. She held a flimsy paper plate covered with cheap aluminum foil. She didn't look like the confident daughter I once raised. She looked exhausted, her eyes darting nervously around the shed, as if she were afraid someone might catch her speaking to me. Without meeting my eyes, she shoved the plate toward my chest. "I brought you breakfast," she muttered stiffly. "It's just leftover pancakes and eggs from the catering Logan ordered." Then she added quickly, "Just eat it and stay quiet today, Dad. Don't come up to the house and don't make a scene. Logan's parents are already stressed about the altitude, and the last thing I need is you embarrassing me in front of them. Honestly, you should be grateful we're even letting you stay on the property." I slowly accepted the plate from her trembling hands. The food was cold, the pancakes stiff, and the eggs rubbery. It was nothing more than scraps from the table of the people who had invaded my home. I looked down at the pathetic meal, then back up at the woman standing in front of me. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the plate. Instead, I peeled back the foil, took a slow bite of the cold pancake, and chewed deliberately while looking directly into her eyes. The silence stretched long enough to make her uncomfortable. She crossed her arms defensively and tapped her expensive boots against the concrete. "What's that look supposed to mean?" she snapped, her voice wavering slightly. "We're dealing with a lot right now. Derek is under enormous pressure with his investment firm, and we're trying to manage your assets before you ruin everything because of your age. You should be thanking him for stepping in." Without waiting for a response, she spun around and marched out of the shed, slamming the heavy door behind her. The sound echoed through the small space, leaving me alone again in the cold wooden box. I placed the plate aside, untouched after that single bite. The time for fatherly patience had ended. I turned back to the hidden panel and powered up my server bank again. The equipment hidden inside that shed wasn't just a security monitoring system. It was a complete command center built from enterprise-grade components I had collected during decades of corporate demolition projects. I activated a network scanning tool I had written myself, software designed to monitor and intercept every bit of data moving across my property's local network. When Derek changed the front door code, he forgot one crucial detail. The entire wireless router still answered to my master administrative node. He was conducting his business, syncing his devices, and browsing the internet on a network I controlled from the shadows. Within seconds, his laptop's IP address appeared on my monitor like a glowing red beacon. He had been careless, his firewall disabled, file-sharing ports wide open. It took less than 3 minutes to bypass his passwords and gain full administrative access to his hard drive. Quietly, I began downloading gigabytes of his personal and corporate files into my encrypted server. At that point, I wasn't just searching for evidence of the fraudulent loan anymore. I was preparing to dismantle his entire life piece by piece. I sat in the freezing shed watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. Every document he believed was hidden was now falling into my hands. Youth often underestimates the quiet patience of age. Derek believed his corporate background made him untouchable, but he was playing inside a digital system I helped build decades earlier. Methodically, I began sorting through his emails, bank statements, and concealed financial liabilities. I was quietly constructing a perfect cage around Logan without him realizing the walls were closing in. As the encrypted files continued downloading onto my private server, the truth behind Logan's so-called financial empire slowly revealed itself. For 5 years, the Mercer family had paraded through elite country clubs and luxury events, proudly boasting about their powerful investment fund. They drove leased luxury cars, dressed in designer clothing, and hosted extravagant parties that projected the illusion of enormous generational wealth. But the spreadsheets and hidden financial logs on Logan's laptop exposed a devastating reality. The Mercer Fund was collapsing. Logan had made several reckless investments in commercial retail properties right before the market shifted dramatically, and the losses were catastrophic. His firm was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. Millions were owed to impatient private investors, and the company's accounts were dangerously overdrawn. The luxurious lifestyle they were flaunting at my cabin was nothing more than a desperate facade built on debt and lies. In reality, they were completely broke. Richard Mercer, the same man who had thrown his car keys at me like I was a servant, had secretly filed for bankruptcy 2 years earlier to escape his creditors. Logan's entire survival now depended on securing a $2 million loan using my $3 million cabin as collateral. That money would temporarily patch his firm's losses and prevent federal investigators from discovering he had misused his client's funds. My property was the only lifeline keeping the Mercer family from financial ruin. This was no longer a simple matter of rude relatives invading my home. I was dealing with desperate criminals who had nothing left to lose. As I searched through Logan's chaotic folders, scanning documents filled with aggressive corporate abbreviations and shady financial records, a strange file name caught my attention. It was hidden inside a subfolder labeled Legal Contingencies, and the file was titled Medical Record Miles Jackson. A chill ran down my spine as I opened the PDF. The document carried the official letterhead of a prestigious private psychiatric clinic in the city. I read through the pages carefully, and the contents made my blood run cold. The report described severe memory loss, unstable emotional behavior, violent tendencies, and an inability to manage personal hygiene or financial responsibilities. At the bottom of the document was the final diagnosis, printed in bold letters. Stage 2, Alzheimer's disease. The signature belonged to Dr. Eris Thorne, a well-known but notoriously unethical psychiatrist who catered to wealthy clients. I had never met this man. I had never visited his clinic. Yet the report recommended that my son-in-law, Logan Mercer, be granted full legal guardianship over my life and my entire estate. Logan hadn't simply forged a power of attorney, he had purchased a fake medical diagnosis to erase my legal rights completely. His plan was simple: declare me mentally incompetent, lock me away in a psychiatric facility, and drain my assets to pay off his debts. As I stared at the forged signature glowing on the screen, the situation became terrifyingly clear. This was no longer about stealing my cabin. They were attempting to erase me from society entirely. My fists tightened as a cold resolve settled in. I wasn't going to simply defend my property anymore. I was going to destroy them completely. The afternoon sun warmed the mountain air, while the Mercer family moved their celebration onto the large wooden deck I had built with my own hands. Through the security cameras, I watched them laughing, drinking, and pretending to be the perfect wealthy family. The scent of expensive Wagyu steaks and imported cigars drifted down to my cold shed. Suddenly, the shed door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't Jada. Logan stood in the doorway with a smug smile. "Come on out, old man," he said dismissively. "We have a special guest who wants to meet you." I stepped into the sunlight and saw a tall man in a tailored linen suit standing beside him, holding an expensive leather briefcase. His cold eyes studied me carefully. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne," Logan announced with fake concern. "He's a close family friend who came to check on your health." It was the same man whose signature was on the fraudulent diagnosis. I shook his hand and immediately forced my own fingers to tremble, slumping my shoulders to appear weak and confused. "Hello, Miles," Dr. Thorne said slowly, speaking to me like a child. "Logan mentioned you've been forgetting things lately. How are you feeling today?" I looked around the yard as if completely disoriented. "Who are these people?" I murmured shakily. "Why are they in my house? I thought Karen was making dinner tonight." Mentioning my late wife, as if she were still alive, was deliberate. Logan exchanged a satisfied smile with the doctor. Dr. Thorne pulled out a small notebook and began asking clinical questions. "Karen passed away 5 years ago, Miles," he said calmly. "Do you know what year it is? Who is the current president?" He was conducting a fake cognitive test right there in my yard, trying to provoke a reaction he could document as proof of mental instability. If I shouted, it would become evidence of aggression. If I stayed silent, it would become evidence of withdrawal. So I performed perfectly. I stuttered, forgot names, mispronounced simple words, and even pretended not to remember Logan, referring to him as that loud boy. I stared blankly at the trees and asked if it was time to go to work at the factory. I gave them a flawless performance of severe dementia, Dr. Thorne nodded sympathetically while scribbling notes. "It's all right, Miles," he said gently, placing a patronizing hand on my shoulder. "We'll make sure you receive the specialized care you need. Logan and Jada will see that you stay safe in a proper medical facility." Hearing them openly plan my imprisonment in my own yard was staggering. They believed I was a helpless old man with no resources to fight back. What they didn't understand was that after 40 years in commercial real estate development, I had built powerful relationships across the country, defense attorneys, corporate investigators, and federal agents who owed me favors. I knew exactly which laws they were violating. Falsifying a medical diagnosis for financial gain was a serious federal crime. Conspiracy, elder abuse, identity theft, and wire fraud could easily put them behind bars for decades. While they thought I was struggling to remember the day of the week, I was quietly calculating their future prison sentences. I didn't need to raise my voice or fight them physically. All I had to do was let them keep documenting their own crimes. Every word Logan spoke and every note Dr. Thorne wrote was simply adding more evidence against them. They were digging a legal grave so deep, they had no idea they would never climb out of it. Dr. Thorne's medical license, the very tool he used to make his dirty money, was going to disappear the moment the authorities reviewed this case. Logan, on the other hand, was heading straight toward the full force of federal banking investigators. They believed their privilege and fake wealth made them untouchable in a system that usually crushes people who look like me. But I had spent decades learning how that system truly works, and more importantly, how to use it when someone crosses the wrong line. Logan casually patted Dr. Thorne on the shoulder and laughed loudly, pointing toward the outdoor bar. "Come get a drink, Eris," he said. "The old man's clearly gone. Jada can keep an eye on him." Dr. Thorne smiled and set his expensive leather briefcase on a small wooden table beside the shed. The moment they turned and walked back toward the loud party on the deck, I instantly dropped my confused act. My shaking hands became steady, and my dull expression disappeared. Moving quickly and silently, I pulled a microscopic GPS tracker and audio transmitter from my jacket pocket. Within seconds, I unlatched the buckle on Dr. Thorne's bag and slipped the tiny device deep into an inner lining pocket. I snapped the briefcase shut and returned to my weak posture just before Jada approached to check on me. She glanced at me with clear disgust and ordered me back inside the shed before I embarrassed them. I shuffled inside, closed the heavy door, and immediately walked straight to my hidden server bank. The tracker was already transmitting perfect audio and location data to my computer. I lifted a loose floorboard and retrieved an untraceable burner phone I had saved for emergencies. I typed a secure number belonging to my personal attorney and sent a short message. "Sullivan, initiate the spiderweb protocol." With that single text, the trap was officially sealed. The next morning, sunlight poured through the dusty windows of the garage, cutting bright lines across the concrete floor. I was already awake and standing quietly near the side entrance when I heard the loud crunch of gravel outside. A flashy flatbed tow truck backed aggressively into the driveway. Logan stepped out of the cabin carrying an expensive cup of coffee while leading a greasy man in a cheap suit toward the garage. Logan entered the code into the keypad, and the massive door rolled open with a mechanical hum. I stepped forward from the shadows to see what new theft he had planned. Sitting in the center of the spotless garage beneath a custom tarp was my 1968 Ford Mustang, polished to a flawless mirror finish. Logan grabbed the tarp and ripped it away with dramatic flair, revealing the bright cherry-red paint. Then he casually told the stranger he needed quick cash to cover the weekend catering and luxury alcohol. He was selling my car, to fund the fake wealthy lifestyle he couldn't afford anymore. The buyer walked slowly around the Mustang, running his dirty hands over the paint and chrome. After a moment, he offered a laughably low price, a tiny fraction of the car's real value. Logan didn't even try to negotiate. He just laughed and agreed immediately as long as the car was taken that same day. I stepped out into the open, making it clear I was standing there. Logan rolled his eyes like I was a stray dog that wandered in. He told the buyer to ignore me, pointing dismissively at my chest. According to him, I was just a broke freeloader who had lived off his wife's family for years. He proudly claimed he now owned everything on the property, including the garage and the vehicle inside it. The buyer hesitated for a second, but his greed quickly overpowered any concern. Logan waved the forged power of attorney document again like it gave him unlimited authority. He scribbled a bill of sale and even forged my signature directly on the hood of my own car. I stood perfectly still while he counted the envelope of cash the buyer handed him. Logan sneered and said at least the money would finally be used for something worthwhile instead of collecting dust. He laughed and said my time was over, and the new generation was taking control now. I didn't argue or try to stop them. To Logan, it was just an old piece of metal he could sell quickly to buy more alcohol for his ridiculous party. But he had no idea what that Mustang truly meant. I bought that car 30 years ago for my wife Karen. It was her dream vehicle. She loved driving it along the coast with the windows down while her favorite soul music played through the radio. When her illness made it impossible for her to drive anymore, I spent weekends in that very garage restoring every detail just to make her smile when she looked out the bedroom window. That car wasn't just transportation. It was a living memory of the woman I loved more than anything. Taking my cabin had been an act of greed that I was willing to handle calmly through the law. But touching Karen's car, selling it like cheap scrap to fund a party, crossed a line that could never be forgiven. Logan had just sealed his own fate. I watched silently as the tow truck driver secured heavy chains beneath the Mustang's frame. The metal clanking echoed through the empty garage like a funeral bell. The buyer shook Logan's hand and climbed into the truck. As it slowly rolled down the gravel driveway carrying a piece of my past away, Logan turned back toward me with a smug grin. He tapped the envelope of cash in his jacket and ordered me to clean the guest bathrooms before his family woke up. Then he walked away toward the warm cabin, completely unaware of the mistake he had just made. The moment he disappeared from sight, I pulled out my burner phone. I zoomed in and photographed the tow truck's license plate along with the company logo on the door. Then I walked over to the workbench where Logan had carelessly tossed the duplicate copy of the fake bill of sale. I photographed that too, clearly capturing his forged signature beside my printed name. Using my encrypted messaging app, I sent both images to my attorney Sullivan with a short message. Logan Mercer just sold a stolen vehicle across state lines using forged documents. Add grand theft auto and interstate trafficking of stolen goods to the indictment. Any federal prosecutor would immediately recognize the seriousness of that crime. A six-figure classic car sold illegally for quick cash was exactly the kind of sloppy evidence investigators loved. Logan believed he had outsmarted a helpless old man. In reality, he had just handed me the proof needed to put him in a federal prison for many years. As the midday sun climbed over the mountains, I sat back at my hidden surveillance terminal inside the shed and watched the live camera feeds with calm patience. The Mercer family reunion on the main deck was supposed to feature an extravagant 5-course lunch by now, but something told me the celebration was about to collapse. Logan had hired an expensive catering company from the city using the cash he had just pocketed from selling my late wife's Mustang. From the surveillance feed, I watched him pacing nervously across the wide wooden deck, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His face had turned a deep, furious red against the clean white collar of his designer shirt. The catering trucks were already more than an hour late. Through the outdoor microphone, I heard him shouting at the event coordinator. "What do you mean you can't get through the lower gate?" he yelled, his voice cracking with rage. "Just enter the code and drive up the road. Don't tell me the gate is locked. I own this property." He ended the call and slammed his fist against the railing. Around him, nearly 20 Mercer relatives sat at decorated tables with empty plates, complaining loudly about the lack of food. Richard Mercer tapped his empty crystal glass impatiently, while Patricia dramatically fanned herself as if she were starving. Logan needed someone to blame for this disaster, and I knew exactly where he was headed. 2 minutes later, the door to my shed burst open again. Logan stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, fists clenched tight. He stormed toward me and pointed a shaking finger at my face. "What did you do to the main gate?" he demanded. "The catering trucks are stuck at the checkpoint. The keypad is locked and the override isn't responding. You sabotaged it, didn't you?" I remained seated calmly on my cardboard bed, watching him unravel. "I didn't touch the gate," I answered evenly. "The access system resets automatically for unauthorized commercial vehicles. If you truly manage this property now, you should know how to fix it." Logan stepped closer, trying to intimidate me with his size. "Listen carefully, you pathetic old man," he hissed. "My family is hungry and my investors are arriving soon. If you don't give me the master code right now, I'll drag you down this mountain myself." Jada appeared behind him, looking embarrassed and anxious. "Logan, please stop," she whispered, grabbing his arm. "Maybe the power grid is down. We can drive to the gate and escort the trucks up." Logan jerked his arm away angrily. "I'm not driving 5 miles down a dirt road like a delivery boy," he snapped. "This old man sabotaged the system just to embarrass me." I looked past him at my daughter. "Are you enjoying your luxury weekend, Jada?" I asked coldly. "Your successful husband seems to be struggling with his new empire." Logan kicked a storage bin across the floor in frustration. "Tell me the code," he shouted. I slowly stood up, matching his height and forcing him to step back slightly. "There is no code," I said calmly. "The gate isn't broken. It's legally closed to commercial traffic. You can't authorize trucks to drive up that road because you don't own it." Logan stared at me in disbelief before laughing mockingly. "What kind of Alzheimer nonsense is that?" he scoffed. "I have the deed to this property. The driveway connects to the highway. I control who comes here." His mistake was typical of arrogant men who never bother reading legal details. When I bought this mountain property 20 years ago, I didn't just purchase the 3 acres surrounding the cabin. At the time, I was the chief structural engineer for Jackson Commercial Real Estate, the company I built from a small construction crew into a regional development firm. I intentionally separated the property titles. The cabin itself sat on residential land, but the 5-mile paved road leading up the mountain was purchased separately through a corporate trust belonging to my company. That road was not residential property. It was registered as private corporate infrastructure. I maintained full legal authority over who could use it. Logan had forged documents to control my personal assets, but he had absolutely no jurisdiction over my corporate holdings. In simple terms, he was trapped on a small island, and I controlled the only bridge leading off it. Logan shook his head with forced laughter. "You're delusional," he sneered. You're inventing fake laws because you're desperate." Without another word, he stormed out of the shed with Jada rushing behind him. Once they left, I calmly picked up my burner phone and sent a short message to the private security firm contracted by my corporation. "Enforce corporate perimeter. Trespassers attempting breach of mountain access road." Then I returned to the surveillance monitors and watched Logan's SUV race down the winding road toward the lower gate. 15 minutes later, the security camera feed from the checkpoint appeared on my screen. Logan jumped out of his vehicle and marched toward the steel barrier. Before he could even touch the gate, 2 armored black security SUVs rolled into view from the opposite side. 4 uniformed officers stepped out, hands resting casually on their belts. I increased the audio feed as the lead officer approached Logan. "Sir, this road is restricted corporate property," he stated firmly. "Please present a valid transit permit. Without authorization, we will turn these commercial trucks away and cite you for trespassing." Logan froze, staring at the officers and the locked steel gate. His hands searched his pockets, but he had nothing to show them. For the first time since arriving on my property, he realized he was completely trapped. Back at the cabin, the Mercer family reunion was quickly collapsing into chaos. I watched from the shed as frustration spread across the deck. Without the catering trucks, there was no food on the mountain, and the alcohol they had been drinking only made everyone more aggressive. Richard Mercer paced angrily while complaining about the incompetence of his hosts. Patricia Mercer, clutching an empty wine glass, turned her sharp voice toward my daughter. "Your father is a useless old man," she sneered loudly. "We let him stay here and he ruins our entire weekend. Go down there right now and make him fix this." Desperate to satisfy these people, Jada rushed down the path toward my shed. The door flew open and she burst inside, her eyes red with humiliation. "Dad, you need to stop this right now," she pleaded breathlessly. "Logan just called from the gate." "The armed guards won't let the catering trucks through. Call whoever you know and fix this immediately. You're ruining everything," Jada shouted, breathless and desperate, storming into the shed. I remained seated in front of the dark monitors, calm, unyielding. "You want me to unlock the gate so your husband can feed the people who just called me useless?" I asked, my voice ice cold. Jada stomped her designer boot, pointing a trembling finger. "You owe them an apology. You need to go up there, apologize to Richard and Patricia, and then open the road." I stood slowly, closing the distance between us, eye contact sharp and unbroken. "Let me ask something simple, Jada," I said, my tone deadly serious. "Did you know Logan used my forged signature to use this cabin as collateral for a $2 million commercial loan?" She froze. Color drained from her face. Her eyes darted toward the door as if searching for escape. She swallowed hard, then crossed her arms defensively. "He's just facing a temporary liquidity crisis," she argued, frantic. "The market shifted. We just need to leverage this property to save his fund. You have investments, Dad. Sacrifice a little to help your daughter. He'll pay it back once things stabilize." I looked at her and felt the final thread of paternal love snap. 32 years of sacrifice, providing elite schools, lavish trips, and a grand wedding, had produced this greedy, calculating stranger who saw my lifelong devotion as a resource to be plundered. The sweet daughter Karen and I raised was gone. I was no longer a father. I was a seasoned survivor facing a dangerous parasite. I took a slow step back, voice cold and final. "You've chosen your new family, Jada. Go back up there and starve with them." She shrieked, kicking a plastic bucket and storming out, slamming the door. The latch clicked shut behind her. I pulled away the false wall to my hidden server bank, bringing monitors to life. Every intercepted document was organized: forged power of attorney, Thorne's fake Alzheimer's report, the fraudulent Mustang bill of sale, and extensive ledgers proving Logan's insolvency. I opened an encrypted email portal routed through an offshore VPN, attached every file into a single irrefutable dossier, and addressed it to the lead FBI white-collar investigator I had personally worked with years ago. Subject line: Comprehensive evidence of interstate wire fraud, medical forgery, and identity theft by Logan Mercer. I clicked send. The progress bar turned solid green. The federal trap was sprung. Their destruction had begun. On the mountain, the Mercer family descended into chaos, starving, furious, and out of alcohol. Logan had no catering, no meal, yet he desperately needed the $2 million loan to avoid bankruptcy. Through the monitors, I watched him make his last desperate move. A black armored SUV appeared on the crushed gravel, bypassing the lower gate with a high-level corporate access code. Stepping out was Arthur Sterling, chairman of Sterling Vanguard Investment Fund. Logan practically sprinted to greet him, smoothing his suit and forcing confidence. He hoped to impress the billionaire using my cabin as a facade of wealth, unaware his every word was recorded. Arthur stepped into the living room, surveying the custom stonework and massive oak beams. Logan puffed up beside him, boasting, "Welcome to my private mountain retreat. I recently acquired this estate through a family trust, fully paid, highly exclusive, and perfect collateral for our venture." He was laying the groundwork for federal fraud in my living room, blind to reality. I seized the moment. I donned dirty coveralls and gloves, smeared soil across my face, and marched in as a lowly groundskeeper, carrying a tray with 3 cups of tea. I entered the living room slowly, head slightly bowed. Jada and Patricia recoiled at my filthy appearance. Logan froze mid-presentation, face twisted in rage, and lunged, grabbing my arm. "Stay in the shed! You're ruining my meeting!" he hissed. To Sterling, he stammered an apology. "This is the old groundskeeper. A little senile, forgets his place sometimes. We'll remove him immediately to continue in peace." He tightened his grip, trying to shove me aside, but I stood firm, posture unyielding. I looked past Logan at Sterling. What Logan didn't know was that I controlled the hidden hierarchy of the commercial world. Sterling's public billionaire image masked the fact that 10 years ago his fund nearly collapsed. I had injected $80 million of untraceable corporate capital, restructuring his debts, saving his firm. Jackson Commercial Real Estate, my holding company, owned the majority of Sterling Vanguard. Sterling answered only to me in every major transaction. Logan was now begging my own subordinate for my money, attempting fraud with my stolen house as collateral. The irony was exquisite. He thought he was a financial genius, but he was nothing more than a desperate thief trying to steal crumbs from a giant. I stepped fully into the sunlight streaming through the living room windows, ignoring Logan's frantic attempts to block me. I held the silver tray steady and met Arthur Sterling's eyes without saying a word. Sterling finally looked away from the stone fireplace and focused on the dirty old groundskeeper standing in the middle of the room. The polite business smile vanished instantly. The color drained from his face, and he staggered backward, his polished shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor. His hands shook so badly that his leather portfolio slipped from his grip, scattering confidential papers across the rug. Patricia Mercer gasped at the mess, but Sterling didn't even notice. His wide eyes locked on my face, recognizing the features beneath the dirt and worn coveralls. "Boss?" Sterling whispered, his voice cracking with shock. "Mr. Jackson, what is going on? Why are you dressed like a groundskeeper in your own house?" The panic in his voice froze the entire room. Jada dropped her wine glass, which shattered across the floor. Logan stood frozen, his arms still extended toward the hallway, his eyes darting between me and the terrified investment titan he had been trying so hard to impress. The illusion of his power evaporated instantly. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the wind outside the large windows. Patricia sat stiffly on the leather sofa, her usual sneer replaced with raw fear. Jada stared at the broken glass at her feet, unable to understand how the father she had dismissed moments earlier was being addressed with such respect by a billionaire. But Logan's face revealed the full tragedy. The confident mask he had worn for years collapsed in seconds. His skin turned pale gray, his jaw trembling, as he struggled to process the impossible reality in front of him. The helpless old man he had locked in a shed was being called boss by the most powerful financier in the state. I calmly set the tray down on the coffee table, the soft clink of porcelain echoing like a judge's gavel. Slowly I removed the dirty gloves and tossed them beside Logan's fallen portfolio. I wiped the soil from my cheek with a handkerchief and stood upright, my true posture returning. I didn't raise my voice. Real authority never needs to shout. From inside my coveralls, I pulled a thick manila envelope and dropped it on the glass table in front of Sterling. Logan flinched at the heavy thud. "Go ahead and open it, Arthur," I said calmly. Explain to this young man whose money he's trying to borrow today. Sterling opened the envelope with trembling hands and pulled out the documents I had prepared. The first page showed the forged power of attorney carrying my copied signature. The second was Logan's $2 million loan application submitted earlier that day to the Sterling Vanguard Investment Fund. The third was the falsified medical report signed by Dr. Eris Thorne, claiming I suffered from advanced Alzheimer's. Sterling read in silence, his eyes widening with disbelief before lifting his gaze toward Logan with open disgust. "You submitted a loan request using stolen collateral," he said sharply. "You forged medical records to strip the owner of legal authority. This isn't bad business judgment, Logan. This is federal wire fraud." I stepped closer, watching Logan instinctively retreat. "Did you really think you could use my property to scam my own investment firm?" I asked quietly. "Did you believe you were clever enough to steal millions from the man who built the financial structure you're standing in?" Logan had never understood the network of power around him. When he applied to Sterling Vanguard, he thought it was a distant corporate fund run by anonymous executives. He had no idea the capital behind it came from Jackson Commercial Real Estate, my company. The $2 million he was begging for wasn't institutional money. It was my own capital, accumulated from decades of commercial developments and corporate acquisitions. If his fraudulent loan had been approved, the funds wired to his failing company would have come directly from my private trust. In other words, he was attempting to rob my personal vault while using my stolen house as collateral. The stupidity of it was almost poetic. For years, Logan had underestimated me because of my age and quiet demeanor, never realizing he was standing in the presence of the very man controlling the financial ecosystem he desperately wanted to enter. He thought he was hunting a weak animal. In reality, he had walked straight into the jaws of a lion. Logan stared down at the documents spread across the table, evidence of forgery, fraud, and identity theft. He looked at Sterling, who now regarded him with professional contempt, and then at me, the man he had mocked, threatened, and tried to institutionalize. The realization finally hit him all at once. Decades in federal prison for fraud and elder abuse were no longer a distant possibility. They were a rapidly approaching reality. His breathing grew shallow and frantic, his chest heaving beneath his designer suit. The confident charm that once defined him vanished completely, replaced by raw, desperate panic. The charming son-in-law was gone. Only a cornered, terrified man remained. Logan screamed, a raw, guttural sound like a wild animal trapped, twisting his face into violent rage. "Shut up! This is a lie! You're setting me up!" Without warning, he lunged across the shattered coffee table, scattering the hot tea and sending the glass top smashing to pieces. He aimed his desperate hands at me, intent on grabbing the documents and destroying the evidence. The illusion of the sophisticated businessman was dead. What remained was a panicked criminal fighting for his life. Before his fingers could even brush my collar, a massive blur intercepted him. Arthur Sterling's bodyguard, built like a solid wall of muscle, moved with terrifying precision, using Logan's momentum against him. With a brutal twist, Logan was slammed face first into the hardwood floor, the thud reverberating through the room. He groaned, pinned under the bodyguard's weight, his designer suit tearing at the shoulder seam. Patricia Mercer shrieked, clutching her pearls, horror etched into every line of her face. "You are assaulting my son. He is the owner here," she cried. A new sharp voice cut through her hysteria. The oak doors swung wide. Marcus Sullivan, my personal attorney, strode in like a predator wearing a three-piece suit as armor. Two armed security contractors flanked him, hands on duty belts, eyes scanning the room with lethal focus. Patricia faltered, her shrill cries dying in her throat. "I am Marcus Sullivan, Chief Counsel for Mr. Miles Jackson and Jackson Commercial Real Estate," he announced, his voice carrying unflinching authority. "As of 9/1 this morning, the fraudulent power of attorney Logan forced my client to sign has been permanently revoked by federal order." He placed a thick stack of court-stamped documents beside Logan's face. "Furthermore, based on overwhelming evidence of interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted financial extortion, all bank accounts, investments, and credit lines under your name or your firm are frozen." Logan's eyes widened in suffocating terror. "You can't do that! My business, my accounts, you're ruining me!" He wheezed, struggling uselessly beneath the bodyguard's grip. "You ruined yourself, Logan," Sullivan said coldly. Every transaction using stolen collateral is reversed. You have zero liquidity. Not a dime, not for creditors, not for lawyers, not for the catering fiasco you tried to cover up. While Logan and Jada thought they had punished a frail old man, they had handed me uninterrupted time to craft their complete financial destruction. For 48 hours, while they feasted and drank on my deck, I transmitted every forged signature, fake medical report, and fraudulent loan directly to Sullivan's secure servers. With my decades of experience and his legal network, we executed emergency asset freezes in hours, a process that usually takes weeks. Every line of retreat was blocked, every resource cut off. Jada, frozen in shock near the shattered sofa, finally collapsed to her knees, glass cutting her skin unnoticed. Tears streaked her face as she looked at Logan pinned to the floor and then up at me. "Dad, please," she sobbed, voice cracking. "Stop this. We'll leave. We'll return the house. Tell your lawyer to unfreeze our accounts. I'll lose everything. My house, my car, my life. Please. I'm your daughter. I'm your little girl." I looked down, feeling nothing. The daughter I raised had died the moment she handed over the forged documents. You stopped being my daughter the moment you decided my life was expendable for your social status, I said, cold as the mountain wind. I turned to Sullivan, commanding absolute silence. "Retrieve the updated last will and testament finalized this morning. Read the beneficiary clause." He produced a crisp document, clearing his throat. "Pursuant to the directives of Mr. Miles Jackson," Sullivan read clearly, "Jada Mercer is permanently disinherited. All claims to assets, trusts, and capital are revoked. The entire estate is transferred immediately to the Jackson Foundation for Orphaned Youth." Jada let out a heart-wrenching wail. The financial execution was complete. Patricia, however, refused defeat. She pulled her gold-plated smartphone, fingers shaking, and called emergency services. Her story? That her family was being held hostage by a violent, deranged man intent on extortion. She pointed at me, claiming I would be arrested imminently. I did not move. I simply stood in my dirty canvas coveralls, watching her fully commit to her own delusional hysteria, knowing that every lie she told only cemented their total, irreversible ruin. Sullivan let out a dry, humorless chuckle, checking his silver watch as his armed contractors remained motionless by the exits. Jada still sat crying on the floor, her pathetic hope ignited by the thought that her powerful mother-in-law had intervened. The tense silence shattered with the distant wail of heavy sirens echoing up the winding mountain road. The sounds multiplied, aggressive and unrelenting, as a convoy of armored vehicles sped up the driveway I had deliberately left open. Red and blue lights painted the living room walls in chaotic flashes, signaling impending justice. Heavy boots slammed onto the porch as 4 imposing figures entered, clad in dark tactical gear with ballistic vests, yellow stenciled letters glaring across their chests. Patricia Mercer immediately stepped forward, finger pointing at my chest, her triumphant smirk rigid. "Arrest him, right now," she demanded, shrill and commanding, claiming I had violently attacked her innocent son and was attempting extortion. She ordered them to handcuff me, certain her call to the local county dispatcher would summon immediate rescue. She failed to notice the men were not local police. They were elite federal agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division. When I sent the encrypted dossier hours earlier, it wasn't a generic tip. It was a direct transmission to Special Agent Vance, a ruthless federal investigator I had assisted nearly 2 decades ago. The package contained Logan's forged power of attorney, fraudulent medical reports, and interstate wire transfers. Vance secured a federal arrest warrant immediately, bypassing local jurisdiction entirely. By the time Patricia had dialed her emergency call, the raid was already underway. The lead agent ignored her hysteria, brushing past Patricia like a nuisance blocking his path, and stopped at the center of the shattered coffee table. The bodyguard released Logan. He gasped, pushing himself up onto his knees, suit ruined, face streaked with dust and glass shards. Logan looked up at the towering federal agent, expecting rescue and restoration of his stolen authority. Instead, the agent reached for a heavy pair of steel handcuffs, the metallic clink ringing sharply through the room. In a booming baritone, he announced Logan's full name and federal charges: massive interstate wire fraud, identity theft, multiple counts of forgery. He read Logan his rights: twisting the man's arms forcefully behind his back as the cuffs locked cold and tight. Patricia screamed, realizing her son wasn't being saved. He was being hauled to a federal penitentiary. The elite agents dragged Logan through the chaos, his expensive suit hanging in tatters. Guests who had demanded catering and vintage wine an hour ago now scrambled like rats, abandoning coats and fleeing the cabin in panic. The mountain was alive with flashing lights and frantic shadows. Richard Mercer, face purple with rage and disbelief, lunged toward the lead agent, checkbook in hand, attempting to buy his son's freedom. "I'll write a check right now," he barked, voice quivering, desperate to assert his fake patriarchal authority. Sullivan stepped forward, laughing sharply, cutting through the mountain air. He informed Richard that federal wire fraud and identity theft cannot be solved with checkbooks. The emergency injunction I triggered earlier had frozen not only Logan's accounts, but also Richard's, due to his co-signing of business loans for Logan's failing fund. Every asset, investment, and credit line bearing the Mercer name was completely immobilized. Richard's hands shook violently, gold pen clattering to the dirt. He stammered, insisting his logistics company was separate and untouchable. Sullivan leaned in, razor-sharp smile in place, and explained that the federal banks had already initiated clawback procedures to reclaim stolen capital. Richard had zero liquidity. He could not rescue his son, hire lawyers, or even afford a motel for his family. Their empire, built on intimidation and superficial wealth, was obliterated. From the freezing storage shed, I had traced the toxic roots of their intertwined finances and handed the digital roadmap directly to the highest federal authorities. The asset freeze spread like a virus through every corner of their fraudulent empire. Richard, the man who had looked down on my age, race, and quiet demeanor, now collapsed onto the crushed gravel. The sudden, total destruction of his financial fortress left him completely broken. They had underestimated me entirely. I was the architect who had originally designed the very banking security they arrogantly tried to exploit. The Mercer family, long accustomed to crushing everyone beneath their wealth and privilege, had finally met their absolute reckoning. Patricia's wailing abruptly stopped. She stared at Richard in absolute horrifying disbelief, finally understanding they were completely penniless, utterly homeless. Their empire lay in ruins, but my calculated vengeance was far from over. Before the armored federal vehicle carrying Logan could even leave the driveway, a deep, familiar engine roar shattered the mountain silence. A massive flatbed tow truck rumbled up the gravel, carrying Carinus's pristine, cherry-red 1968 Ford Mustang, gleaming under the tactical lights. Behind it, a local sheriff cruiser followed, lights flashing. The greasy buyer who had tried to steal my late wife's car locked in steel handcuffs. The lead federal agent approached the sheriff, listening as the man explained that the buyer had confessed to interstate theft of the car using Logan's forged documents. The agent nodded grimly, pulling a folded secondary warrant from his vest, then turned to the armored vehicle and slid open the small viewing window, locking eyes with Logan's terrified, bruised face. "Grand theft auto and interstate trafficking of stolen property," he boomed, "have been added to your federal felony charges." Logan buried his face in his chained hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the weight of his imminent decade-long prison sentence crushed him completely. The flashing tactical lights faded down the mountain road, leaving the cabin in suffocating silence. Jada stood alone amid the shattered remnants of the living room, shards of broken glass surrounding her. The arrogant party guests had vanished, leaving only the debris of their failed celebration. Patricia and Richard, having witnessed their son hauled away and their financial empire obliterated, turned their venomous attention to the final target. The cold mountain wind blew through the open doors, chilling the ruined room. Patricia paced aggressively in high heels, a cornered animal desperate to strike. She confronted Jada, face twisted in hatred, fingers shaking violently, screaming that her daughter-in-law was a useless curse, responsible for dragging their perfect family into ruin. Richard joined in, spitting insults and blaming Jada for his son's failures, abandoning her the second their fake wealth collapsed. Jada trembled violently, absorbing the verbal assault from the people she had spent her life trying to impress. She finally recognized the truth. The Mercer family had never seen her as anything but a disposable scapegoat. When Patricia raised a hand as if to strike, Jada collapsed completely, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor shards of glass cutting into her designer jeans. She crawled frantically toward me, wrapping her trembling arms around my work boots, burying her tear-stained face against the tough canvas of my coveralls. But the man who would have comforted her had died the moment she handed over those forged hospital documents. I did not move. I did not speak. My hands stayed buried in my pockets, rigid and unmoving. Sullivan observed silently, detached and clinical. I slowly removed my boot from her grasp, stepping back deliberately. "You made your choice, Jada," I said coldly, voice echoing through the vaulted room. "You abandoned the father who built your life from scratch to please people who never cared about you. You traded your soul for an illusion, and now you face the consequences." She gasped, choking on her own tears, unable to form a coherent word. Now she begged for my protection only because the Mercer family lay in ruins, facing federal consequences. She did not cry out of remorse. She cried because her luxurious, fraudulent life had collapsed. Had Logan succeeded, she would be sipping wine on my deck, unconcerned about my permanent absence, gladly spending my money without guilt. That brutal reality severed the last threads of my parental obligation. A parasite does not deserve shelter merely because it once lived off the host. I had spent a lifetime providing. I would not serve as a safety net for a greedy, ungrateful betrayer. Jada remained crumpled on the floor, sobbing violently, while Patricia and Richard glared with undisguised contempt. Before I could instruct my security team to remove the hostile Mercers, the heavy wooden doors thudded open. The lead federal agent returned, boots crunching over broken glass, ignoring the Mercer parents' furious glares. He walked deliberately to Jada, who raised her tear-stained face in blind panic. From his vest, he produced a thick manila envelope and dropped it next to her bleeding, trembling hands. "Jada Mercer," he announced in a booming voice that cut through her sobs. "You are hereby formally served with a federal subpoena and immediate summons. You are indicted as a fully willing co-conspirator in multiple counts of interstate wire fraud and banking deception. Your signature is present on forged commercial loan applications, and you are commanded to appear in federal court to answer these felony charges. Failure to appear will result in an immediate bench warrant for your arrest." Patricia and Richard watched, stunned, finally realizing the federal government was coming for every single person involved in their massive financial conspiracy. Jada stared at the thick brown envelope resting on the broken glass, her entire life collapsing in an instant. She was trapped, utterly alone, with no hope and no escape from the ruin she had helped create. 3 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open to a packed room of reporters, aggressive federal prosecutors, and nervous spectators. I sat in the front row, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, projecting the immovable strength of a man who had already won. Across the polished aisle sat Logan Mercer, the arrogant finance director who had violently kicked open my cabin door was gone. In his place sat a gaunt, trembling shell of a man, ill-fitting bright orange prison jumpsuit sagging over his frame, messy hair tangled, deep dark circles under his terrified eyes. He bounced his chained legs nervously under the heavy defense table, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Jada sat 2 rows behind, exhausted, isolated, broken. Patricia and Richard Mercer were absent, having fled the state the moment their corporate bankruptcy proceedings began. The federal judge entered, robes flowing, commanding absolute silence. The time for cheap manipulation, entitlement, and empty threats was over. The defense attorney, a high-paid corporate shark, rose and launched into a desperate, theatrically tragic performance, pacing before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice booming, "Logan Mercer is not a criminal mastermind. He is a desperate family man, manipulated and entrapped by a ruthless corporate predator." He pointed at me dramatically. "Miles Jackson harbors deep personal hatred, hiding his wealth to drive Logan into panic, destroying him for personal revenge." The claim was absurd, insulting, and transparently the only card they had left. Logan nodded vigorously, playing the martyr, but I remained unmoved. Sullivan adjusted his silk tie, a predatory smile on his face, perfectly calm. Sullivan rose, addressing the judge with precise authority. Your Honor, the defense weaves a fictional narrative of racial and class entrapment to distract from undeniable evidence of premeditated federal fraud. My client did not forge his own medical records. He did not solicit a $2 million commercial loan under false pretenses. He certainly did not coerce the defendant to sell a classic vehicle to a known criminal across state lines. He walked to the evidence table, lifting thick printed bank statements for the jury to see. The defendant acted with malicious autonomy, motivated entirely by reckless greed and the desperate need to maintain a fraudulent high society lifestyle. He aggressively exploited a man he thought helpless. The defense attorney objected immediately, claiming the financial records were circumstantial, insisting Logan genuinely believed he had legal authority and was merely helping a deteriorating elder. The audacity of the lie hung heavy in the courtroom, but Sullivan smiled like a shark. He formally requested submission of Exhibit 42 into the record. As the court technician prepared the advanced audio equipment, I sat still, recalling the relentless work of the past 3 months. While Logan rotted in maximum security holding, I had collaborated directly with the FBI, granting Special Agent Vance unrestricted access to my corporate servers. We did not just build a case, we constructed an airtight titanium vault of undeniable evidence. Every fraudulent wire transfer, bounced check, illegal signature, every dark web proxy used to hire Dr. Eris Thorne, who had agreed to testify against Logan, was meticulously documented. We traced the collapse of his retail fund to his exact actions, leaving no loophole. The buyer of Karen's Mustang had also flipped, testifying that Logan bragged about stealing the car. Every path, every excuse, every lie was eliminated. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. Sullivan hit play. Logan's arrogant voice echoed across the federal room, captured by the hidden shed microphone, destroying any illusion of innocence. "You are delusional," Logan sneered in the recording. "You're making up fake corporate laws to hold on to power. I have the deed, property lines, the power of attorney Jada got you to sign. You're a broke fool, and I'm taking everything." Logan sat paralyzed. Color drained from his face as he heard his own words mocking him and proving his exploitation. The defense attorney dropped his gold pen, realization dawning that his entire entrapment narrative had been obliterated in an instant. The jury, the gallery, even the judge could see the cold, undeniable truth. Logan's greed and deliberate fraud were fully exposed. The jury stared at Logan with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The federal judge, a stern, uncompromising man with zero tolerance for arrogant white-collar criminals, leaned forward and slammed his heavy wooden gavel. The deafening crack echoed like a gunshot through the courtroom, signaling the unavoidable end of Logan Mercer's entire life. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, as the finality settled over everyone present. The jury had deliberated less than 3 hours, a remarkably short span that spoke volumes about the clarity of the evidence we presented. Logan rose from the defense table, chained hands trembling uncontrollably, as the 4 jurors stood to read the verdict. Guilty on all 12 counts of interstate wire fraud. Guilty on 3 counts of severe identity theft. Guilty on interstate trafficking of stolen goods and gross elder abuse. Each word struck him like a physical blow to the chest. His expensive defense attorney stared blankly at his notes, completely defeated by the cold, digital reality of his client's profound stupidity. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, eyes piercing. "Logan, with unadulterated contempt, the time for excuses was over. You actively weaponized your corporate background to orchestrate a predatory, calculated scheme against a man you deemed vulnerable. You forged medical documents and attempted to steal millions to fund a pathetic illusion of wealth. You are a profound danger to the financial ecosystem and a disgrace to society. I hereby sentence you to 96 months in a maximum security federal penitentiary without possibility of early parole." Logan gasped sharply, collapsing back into his chair. 8 years. By the time he was free, he would be 42, his youth and career obliterated. The judge did not pause. He ordered immediate liquidation of all remaining Mercer family corporate accounts to satisfy massive federal restitution. The fake retail empire Richard and Patricia had used to bully high society was legally demolished and auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. The judge shifted his gaze toward the gallery, locking onto Jada. Jada Mercer, due to your cooperative testimony against your husband and the clear evidence you were manipulated into signing secondary loan documents, you are cleared of primary federal conspiracy charges. You will not serve prison time. Jada's sobs exploded, burying her tear-stained face in her hands. The judge continued, voice cutting through her relief. However, you remain legally bound to joint financial accounts opened under your marital name. You are personally responsible for the remaining $500,000 in corporate credit card debt your husband accrued. Immediate restitution payments are mandatory. Failure to comply will result in wage garnishment and total asset seizure. Jada froze, realizing she had avoided prison only to inherit a massive, unpayable mountain of debt. She had lost her husband, her home, her status, her future. The $500,000 liability, tied directly to federal restitution, would follow her for life, draining paychecks, destroying credit, and making homeownership impossible. She had traded a debt-free foundation for fleeting social validation, now enslaved by the very financial system her arrogance had tried to manipulate. Federal bailiffs hauled Logan away, chains rattling, his head down, staring at the floor as his nightmare began. The courtroom emptied, leaving Jada alone on the bench, crushed under the weight of her ruin. I rose, buttoned my custom suit, and calmly walked up the aisle, ignoring her soft whimpers. Pushing open the oak doors, I stepped into the bright sunlight, breathing deeply. Victory belonged entirely to me. My private driver waited, engine running, luxury black sedan gleaming. Before I could reach the car, the frantic clicking of heels announced Jada. She burst out, hair a mess, eyes red, shivering, utterly destitute. She staggered toward my vehicle, hands clasped in desperate plea, hoping I would rescue her from the ruins of her own making. She pressed herself against the car, expensive clothes rumpled, makeup ruined. "Dad, please wait," she rasped, voice breaking, begging. "The bank took the condo. I have nothing. Please let me come back. I'll do whatever you want. I'll clean, cook, earn my keep. Please, just take me home." I stood perfectly still on the sidewalk, unfazed by her public breakdown, indifferent to the spectacle, completely void of any parental urge to comfort her or solve her self-inflicted crisis. "That cabin is my private home, Jada," I stated, voice dangerously calm, utterly devoid of warmth. "It is not a homeless shelter for convicted federal accomplices, and it is certainly not a backup plan for a traitor who actively tried to destroy my life." She gasped violently, tears streaming, clutching the tailored sleeve of my custom jacket. "Dad, it was all Logan," she cried desperately, attempting to shift the weight of her guilt onto her imprisoned husband. "He lied to me about everything. He manipulated my signature. I didn't know how evil his plan truly was. I just wanted us to be a successful, powerful family." I removed her trembling hand with cold precision, smoothing the expensive fabric. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the naive victim," I said sharply, cutting through her wall of excuses. "You stood in my freezing storage shed, handed me cold leftover pancakes like I was a stray dog, and demanded I sacrifice my hard-earned property so your husband could pay off hidden debts. You only care that he got caught because you lost access to the stolen money. If he had succeeded in stealing my $2 million equity and locking me in a psychiatric ward, you'd be spending it in Europe right now, oblivious to my existence." Jada shrank back, face pale, fully aware that my assessment was brutally accurate. "But I am your daughter," she wheedled, the only card left in her desperate hand. "I am your own flesh and blood. You cannot leave me out here to starve. You are supposed to protect me." My mind immediately returned to a quiet, sterile hospital room 5 years ago, sitting beside Karina's bed, holding her frail hand as aggressive cancer took her from me. Her tired, piercing eyes had given me one final, crucial piece of advice I had foolishly ignored until this moment. "Miles, you cannot buy a person a moral compass. Unconditional love does not mean funding someone else's toxic greed. If she chooses darkness, you must find the strength to close the door and let her face the cold." I had spent years burying my head in sand, throwing money at her problems, hoping she would grow into decency. But Karen was right. Jada had fully surrendered to the Mercer family's superficial rot, and no wealth could fix her corrupted character. She had crossed a fatal boundary. I focused on her sobbing form, clarity shielding me from manipulation. You chose fake luxury and ruthless deceit over the father who built your life, I said, voice carrying the finality of a federal sentence. You wanted high-stakes corporate games. Now pay the ultimate price. She fell to her knees, hands clasped, in a pathetic plea. Dad, please, what am I supposed to do now? Her voice echoed off the surrounding concrete. I remembered Logan kicking open my cabin door weeks ago, demanding I make room for their family, and my calm reply then. Pack your bags, Jada, I said, voice a freezing, razor-sharp whisper. She looked at me in confusion. I have no bags left. The Federal Bank took everything. I gave a single cold smile, glancing at her ruined designer shoes. Then I highly suggest you start walking, and turned my back, leaving her behind. I stepped into the luxurious leather interior of my waiting sedan. My driver immediately closed the heavy door, sealing me inside my fortress. The tinted window rose slowly, silencing her frantic screams. The engine roared, and the vehicle merged into city traffic, leaving Jada Mercer alone on the cold, unforgiving sidewalk. The drive up the winding mountain road was peaceful, the city's chaos and aggression fading behind us. We passed the fortified lower gate where Logan had lost his composure weeks ago. Guards nodded respectfully as we rolled past. Pulling into the long, crushed gravel driveway of my estate, the mountain's profound silence welcomed me like an old friend. The chaotic swarm of Mercer vehicles and their entitled shouting were gone, erased as if they had never existed. The air smelled clean, free of cheap cologne and burnt catering. I stepped out of the sedan onto the pristine driveway, staring at the massive, custom-built oak cabin, solid and unbothered, projecting permanence. I walked up the wide wooden steps, boots thudding rhythmically against the treated timber, stopping at the main double doors, eyes fixed on the sleek, flashing digital smart lock Logan had arrogantly installed. Its glowing red keypad was a pathetic parasite clinging to the wood I had personally selected decades ago. I ignored it, circling to the side, entering through the mudroom, and walked straight to my heavy-duty tool chest. I grabbed a thick steel crowbar, a high-powered cordless drill, and a set of specialized metal extractors. Back on the front porch, cold focus burning in my chest, I wedged the crowbar under the cheap plastic housing of Logan's modern digital lock and slammed downward with brutal force. The expensive, high-security tech cracked loudly, snapping off the door frame, exposing fragile internal wiring. I tossed the shattered plastic over the railing, letting it smash into a dozen useless fragments on the hard-packed dirt below, a violent, physical purge of the lingering Mercer stain on my property. I reached into my canvas tool bag and pulled out the solid brass deadbolt I had removed years ago when I upgraded the security system. Freezing cold to the touch and mechanically perfect, it required a physical key to turn the thick steel tumblers. For the next hour, I meticulously installed the massive lock, drilling thick screws deep into the reinforced oak door frame. Turning the key produced a deep, satisfying clunk. The house was now impervious. No flashing lights, no wireless codes, no vulnerable digital networks. A pure, impenetrable physical barrier, bypassable only with my explicit permission. The cabin was officially secured against the outside world. I walked into my private study, a quiet, temperature-controlled room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and massive rolled blueprints from my corporate career. Sitting at my polished mahogany desk, I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, legally binding documents Sullivan had prepared. They were the final, uncompromising execution papers, permanently transferring every asset, property deed, and corporate trust out of Jada's name. For decades, I had carried the suffocating weight of extreme parental financial obligation, hoarding wealth to shield her from the struggles I endured. I thought generational wealth was the ultimate expression of unconditional love. But as I signed my name in thick black ink, redirecting tens of millions to the Jackson Foundation for Orphaned Youth, a massive, suffocating weight lifted from my shoulders. I was finally free, no longer a host for a greedy, ungrateful parasite. My hard-earned millions would now fund full-ride scholarships for brilliant, driven young men and women. Those with moral character my daughter lacked entirely. A new legacy built on merit, determination, and integrity. I closed the leather binder, feeling an unbreakable sense of peace settle over my soul. The late afternoon sun dipped below towering pine trees, casting deep shadows across the property. The air bit sharply, yet I felt completely warm, alive inside. Leaving the cabin, I walked slowly down the familiar dirt path toward the storage shed, where I had orchestrated the Mercer family's complete destruction. The heavy door creaked open, revealing the dark, dusty interior. The cardboard bed still sat in the far corner, surrounded by humming server racks and the false wooden security wall I had built. I began dismantling the flattened boxes and moving blankets, erasing any lingering evidence of my humiliating exile. As I lifted a heavy plastic storage bin, a small square object slipped out, tapping gently against the cold concrete floor. Kneeling, I picked up a solid silver picture frame, my only personal item secretly smuggled into the shed when Logan had locked me out. Inside was a faded photograph of Karen, smiling during our first summer on this mountain, long before the cabin existed. Her natural hair blew wildly in the wind, her expression radiant and at peace. Logan's violent tantrum had nearly shattered the glass protecting her face. I wiped the dust away, holding her image to my chest, feeling a surge of deep, unexpected emotion. The brutal corporate war was over. The greedy, aggressive enemies were vanquished. But a new, profound emotional truth revealed itself in the silence of the setting mountain sun. Morning crested over jagged peaks, painting the valley in orange and purple hues. The cold air entered my lungs like a wave of renewal. In my quiet kitchen, the coffee maker dripped into my favorite heavy ceramic mug. The silence of the cabin, once suffocating, now felt like a welcome companion, a blank canvas belonging entirely to me. I carried my mug to the wraparound balcony and sank into the wooden rocking chair Karen and I had bought together. The old wood creaked under me, a comforting anchor to the present. I gazed across the untouched nature, remembering the days spent cutting timber and laying this very deck, every nail in its perfect place. The world awoke, indifferent to the corporate wars and human betrayals that had recently stained this sacred ground. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling warmth spread through my chest. The storm had passed. The new dawn was flawless. The quiet was interrupted by the soft buzz of my secure cell phone. Sullivan's encrypted number flashed. I answered, knowing he only called this early, with final updates on our legal demolition. His crisp, professional tone confirmed the absolute final status of the scattered remnants of the Mercer family empire. Sullivan informed me that the federal bankruptcy courts had officially seized the last remaining assets of Richard and Patricia Mercer. The arrogant, fake wealthy couple who had sneered at my rustic cabin and treated me like a lowly servant were violently evicted from their luxury city penthouse. Sullivan traced their financial trail. They were now renting a tiny, dilapidated ground-floor apartment in a notoriously dangerous neighborhood on the far east side of the city. Their fancy leased vehicles had been repossessed. Elite country club memberships terminated in public disgrace. Patricia worked as a low-level customer service representative, taking angry calls from furious retail shoppers just to pay for basic groceries. Sullivan then moved to Jada. My former daughter had completely failed to secure any high-level corporate employment due to her highly publicized federal fraud indictment and catastrophic credit score. Private investigators located her working the graveyard shift as a basic checkout cashier at a massive discount grocery store, scanning cheap food items under buzzing fluorescent lights for minimum wage. Every single dollar of her disposable income was aggressively garnished by the federal government to pay the $500,000 debt Logan had anchored to her name. She commuted nightly on public transport to a tiny rented room shared with 3 strangers living in grinding poverty. 10-hour shifts under rude customers and abusive managers, stripped of designer clothes and elite social circles. I listened silently, feeling neither vindictive joy nor lingering fatherly pity, only cold, hard satisfaction. They had tried to steal the fruits of my life. Now they choked on the bitter harvest of their own toxic greed. I thanked Sullivan, ended the call, and set the phone face down. Leaning back in the rocking chair, I stared out over the mist rolling across the pristine mountain lake. For decades, I had believed blood demanded endless sacrifice and unconditional forgiveness. My grief over Karen had blinded me to my daughter's toxic entitlement. I had thought shielding her from poverty was my ultimate duty, but protecting someone from consequences only breeds a monster. True family is not genetics or a shared last name. True family is mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and solid moral integrity. Letting go of Jada was the hardest emotional and physical task of my life, but also the most necessary. Respecting my legacy and honoring Karen's memory outweighed maintaining a toxic relationship with a parasite wearing my daughter's face. My wealth was now secured for the Jackson Foundation, funding the brilliant futures of students who truly deserved it. I had learned the ultimate lesson. You cannot buy true love. You cannot negotiate with relentless greed. You can only cut the infection out and let the wound heal in clean air. I rose, breathing in the crisp mountain pine air, leaving my empty coffee mug behind. Down the wide wooden steps toward the dirt path, I grabbed my worn fishing rod, feeling the familiar cork handle in my hand. Morning dew soaked my boots and canvas coveralls as I walked down the trail to the long wooden dock. The lake surface was perfect glass, reflecting towering pines and bright sky. I checked the nylon line, attached a simple silver lure, and cast into the deep water. The splash broke the reflection, sending concentric ripples outward. Alone on the dock, I felt solid earth beneath my boots, the warm morning sun on my face. No arrogant shouts, no fake smiles hiding malicious intent. The corporate wars were over, the greedy, ruthless invaders vanquished, locked in their cages, the natural order of my universe violently restored. I watched the bobber float on the calm lake as mountains sang their morning songs. Perfect peace belongs only to those with the courage to defend it. My name is Miles Jackson. My sanctuary is finally, unconditionally mine. The ultimate lesson is simple. True power never needs to announce itself. Arrogance mistakes silence for weakness, humility for ignorance. Logan and the Mercers saw my age, race, and quiet life, and assumed I was a helpless target. They relied on loud boasts and superficial status. I relied on decades of hard work and patient calculation. True strength is built in the shadows, forged by resilience and grit, not bought on credit to impress strangers. Never underestimate the quiet ones. If you enjoyed this story, like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below.